say is clear. It hasn't changed. It is in the settings you've said, for reasons that are, it can be difficult to sometimes maintain physical distancing on public transport and in indoor settings, particularly in retail settings, and that's why we've recommended them for use in those settings. But maybe we think the message hasn't fully gotten through, even though we've been clear, and so we think we want to now redouble our efforts, if you like, to communicate clearly to the public the importance of this particular measure. We've all seen from our own daily experience. I've seen it when I've been in my local Dunnes stores. I wear a mask, but I can see that the majority of people are not wearing masks. And I think we see this as an important measure. We see it as an additional measure to all the other measures that we recommend. It doesn't replace the need for other things like hand washing and so on. But we think it's an important measure, and we'd like to see a higher level of compliance in relation to it. And so we're going to be stepping up our communications and public information with some radio, television ads and so on over the course of the next period of time to emphasise for people the circumstances, how to wear them in such a way as to both to protect yourself, and maybe some of the things to be aware of, that if you don't wear them properly, it can paradoxically increase the risk of transmission of infection. We want to try and clarify all of that for people, and how then people can go about making or providing for themselves an appropriate face covering that we think is appropriate for use in those settings.
Will or should face masks be made available to all households or be subsidised?
We have no specific plans in that regard. We've given advice and guidance about the types of masks that can be made and can be made available. We think they're easily available in retail settings, and they can be easily manufactured at home, and there are videos, and we'll be stepping up our own information to the public about how they might be able to do that. So some of the kinds of cloth masks that people can use, not just how to make them, but how to care for them, when to wash them, what temperatures to wash them at, how to iron them, all of those kinds of pieces of information. We have quite an amount of that guidance already available, but I guess we want to try and step up the clarity of that communication, because perhaps the message hasn't been fully getting through. As I've said, our advice and guidance on this has not changed. We haven't changed it now. It has been the same since we have introduced this guidance a number of weeks ago. But we want to now step up, if you like, the communication. What we've seen across all of the advice and guidance, we've had a very high level of compliance on the part of the public, which has been really good. That's the reason that we've managed to suppress this infection to the extent that we have, where we see the low numbers of transmission that we're seeing over the course of the last number of weeks, and we're seeing that being maintained as we ease restrictions. We think the public has been really fantastic in the way in which it has supported the implementation of all that guidance, but we think this particular measure is one that we need to focus on to try and increase the use of face masks in those specific settings.
The number of reported cases, hospitalisations and deaths are falling or stabilising, but at an individual level, are people any less likely to get the virus and to get sick from the virus now than they were in March?
We think it is less likely now, yes, because we think there's probably two reasons. One, because the scale of infection that's likely to be in the population we think is lower. And then two, because we think the behaviours of the population in general terms, the measures that we're taking, each of us as individuals, to protect ourselves, protect our families and our communities, are all contributing to a reduction in the transmission of the infection. So we have a certain level of infection now. It might be in numbers terms not different to what we were experiencing in March, but at the point in early March, we were increasing rapidly in terms of what we were seeing. And what we're now seeing is a sustained decrease in all the important measures. So the R number, which measures that, if you like, the reproductive number shows that we're, if you like, decelerating. Each individual who's got this infection is passing it on to fewer and fewer and fewer people. What was happening in early March is each person with the infection on average was passing it on to more and more people. And the R number was high and was going up. And that's why all of the measures that we put in place over the course of the second half of March, from the 11th of March through to the 28th of March, were necessary to slow down that transmission, to reduce the R number in the way that we've managed to achieve now.
If there is a resurgence, would you propose restrictions like those brought in at the end of March?
And the short answer is no. But what we'll be doing over the course of the next number of weeks with the National Public Health Emergency Team is looking at a scenario where, while we're not necessarily anticipating that it will occur in this way, that if we are to see a resurgence of the disease at a significant level, what measures would in fact be appropriate. Our experience of this illness, we're 2 months further on, 3 months further on than we were in March. And that's not just in this country, that's in every other country. Measures have been in place by way of restrictions and then easing restrictions in lots of countries. We're able to look at all of that experience, and the international community is learning from that experience, and guidance and advice is being made available in relation to that, and that will all inform the decisions that we would take at a point in time. And we have to remember as well that the population's behaviour is very different now than what it would have been in February and March of this year. People now understand much more themselves as individuals, not just about the disease and the risks, but how they can protect themselves. So the important basic measures around hand hygiene, around respiratory etiquette, a really important one to get across to people is that if you have flu-like symptoms, the usual thing that we all do is, let's see how I am in the morning, let's see how I am on Monday, I won't ring the GP until tomorrow. We think it's important when you have these symptoms at an early stage, make telephone contact with your GP, and the GPs have been terrific all the way through this. They know the symptoms that are important, and they will determine and advise you as to whether you need to have a test or not. And if the public come forward early, it gives us the greatest chance of picking up anything untoward in terms of an increase of infection.
Do you see yourself, for example, imposing a restriction where all schools and universities will be closed again?
Well, I think that the work is happening through those sectors at the moment to restore the services that they provide to the public. And we think that the way in which education will be happening might be different than the way in which it was happening back in sort of March and April, and we took or in February and March, I should say, and we took the measures that we took at that point. We would have to look again as to whether those kinds of measures were necessary, but I wouldn't be anticipating at this point in time that we'd be moving back to blanket closures in the way in which you recommended. But those are the kinds of things that we'll be looking at in detail, and we'll come up with that by way of guidance and advice so that we're in a position where, having learned everything that we've learned, having observed what's happened in other countries, to decide what exactly is the appropriate blend of measures to take in the event that we see, as I stress, we're not anticipating, but if it's to happen, a resurgence of the disease, what some people call a second wave, that we would know what specific measures we would take, and we would have that work done proactively.
Knowing what we know now, having learnt lessons from March, knowing more about the disease, would children and young people, for example, be allowed more freedom in the event of there being a resurgence of the disease?
We think that, so we look at children in two ways. One is the risk of the infection for severe impact, if you like, among children. It looks like the impact on children and young people is much less than it is on older people, and we know that now about the virus. But also the question of children as vectors or as, in terms of transmission. So in other words, the likelihood of a child picking up this who doesn't have a serious illness but also passing that illness on to somebody else who might then be impacted. We have to take all of those factors into account. That'll all form part of our decision making and our guidance and advice at a point in time if it becomes necessary for us to have. But we're not anticipating that at this point in time, Gavin. I'd stress that. We've seen continued reduction in the number of cases that we're reporting, broadly speaking, in the various different parameters like admissions to hospital, admissions to intensive care, and so on, even though we're four or more weeks into the easing of restrictions. And that matches an experience that most other countries across Europe have seen. As they've eased restrictions, and we've all had slightly different arrangements in terms of restrictions and the pace at which we have eased them, we have across Europe for the most part seen a continued downward trend in terms of the incidence of the disease and other important markers in most European countries.
Over half of the people who died here came from just 1% of the population in long-term care settings and mostly in nursing homes. Was that scale, almost 1,000 people, was that avoidable?
We think this is a highly transmissible infection. It's significantly easier to transmit than influenza. So preventing transmission of this infection is challenging. Every year we have an experience of influenza where we have significant numbers in exactly these settings picking up flu, and so to absolutely prevent this infection in these kinds of settings isn't realistic. We know the measures that are important in terms of slowing down that transmission. We've seen a significant reduction in transmission in that sector, but we need to continue to offer protection to it, and a range of measures are now in place to achieve exactly that. And while it's been significant in terms of the numbers of deaths that we've seen, we know that it compares in terms of other countries. It's actually to the lower end of mortality experience in European countries. There's been a lot of reporting and comment in relation to this, which we think is erroneous, focusing over simply on the proportion of deaths that occur in this country that are attributed to people living in nursing homes. But we think that overall, the mortality experience that we've had in this country, we report everything. We report probable deaths as well as confirmed deaths. We report deaths that happen not just in hospitals, but right across the community. And that makes us one of a small number of countries in Europe and in the world. So all of the information that we have gathered in relation to mortality in this country, we think it's comprehensive. And it's also important for me to say that when we look at what's called excess mortality, we can see through work that's been done through colleagues in HIQA and elsewhere, analysing the RIP.ie information, which covers about 98% of the deaths that occur in this country. We have seen, we think, about 1,000 extra deaths over the time period since the beginning of this year, and mostly occurring over the months of March and April. And that's less, in fact, than the number of COVID deaths that we're reporting. So we have more than explained all the excess mortality that this country has experienced. There are few countries in a position that are able to say what I've just said about their own mortality experience.
But do you
we've
believe
been very comprehensive and open about how we've reported that.
But do you believe that scale could have been reduced here?
We think it's to the lower end. We'd like to have seen it lower than it was. We think it's to the lower end of experience in terms of mortality across Europe. Europe has been the epicenter of this infection. It's a highly infectious disease which has a significant case fatality when you get into the upper ages, particularly people over the age of 80. And we've seen that there has been, unfortunately, in nursing home settings in particular, a significant mortality experience of that scale. And I'm not complacent about this or taking any comfort from the fact, but it is important to point out that that experience has been to the lower end in comparison to other European countries. A lot of comparison has been drawn between us and countries across Europe. Too early in our view, too simplistic in our view in terms of we're reporting everything. Many countries to whom we're being compared are not reporting comprehensively in the way that we are. And we have done a detailed mortality analysis, and we've done a detailed analysis of our handling of the nursing homes, and we've published both of those. And the Minister has established a process, as I'm sure you're aware now, with independent experts led by Professor Cecily Kelleher from UCD, and they'll report back to the Minister by the end of June. And that will, we hope, identify some further learnings that we can apply to how we can continue to offer protection to this particular sector.
When will people be able to visit their relatives in nursing homes?
We have made advice available last week to government, which was accepted, that we think that the time is right now in public health terms for us to think about lifting the blanket ban across the country in terms of visitation in these settings. And we've given advice to the nursing home sector and identified a date, which is the beginning of next week, to give time to the nursing homes to prepare. Essentially, the arrangement that will be depending on the experience of individuals' nursing homes with this infection. Different guidance and advice might apply. To give time, therefore, for each individual nursing home to understand that guidance and advice, to put it into place, and to recommence visitation where that is possible in those settings. So we're moving from that blanket ban. We made that advice last week available because we were very sensitive to the fact that having a blanket ban against visitation to nursing homes where people live, cutting off family from their loved ones, is a very draconian recommendation. We were very reluctant to introduce it back in March, and we were keen to lift it as soon as possible. We've given that advice last week, and we hope that the nursing home sector will be in a position to implement it as and from next Monday.
And when do you expect people to be able to enter the country without having to quarantine for 2 weeks?
Well, that's still the case. That we think that now that's still our advice. We're asking people to avoid non-essential travel out of Ireland, to have themselves in a situation then where we'll be recommending that they submit themselves to quarantine when they return. And we're asking people who are not from Ireland to not to travel here for non-essential reasons or for tourist reasons. We'll change that advice and guidance when we think it's appropriate and safe to do so. I know a lot of work is now happening at a European level to try to find arrangements between countries. We'll participate as a country in relation to that work. But for now, we're advising in relation to all non-essential travel that does not happen at this point in time, and that this department is looking at putting those arrangements on a statutory footing.
Dr. Tony Holohan, thank you very much for speaking to us on Morning Ireland today. It's 8:55.
The Northern Ireland Protocol will top the agenda at the online meeting today of the joint EU-UK committee tasked with implementing the Brexit withdrawal agreement. It's only the second meeting of the committee. Under the Northern Ireland Protocol, goods moving from Britain to Northern Ireland will be subject to EU customs and regulatory formalities from the 1st of January next year. Let's have a word with our Europe editor, Tony Connolly. Tony, the protocol was agreed, but I suppose the devil is ever